So today we're going to talk about Robinson Crusoe by the English writer Daniel Defoe, which is an English novel from the 1700s. Robinson Crusoe was first published in 1719 and it is one of the most important novels ever written in English. As usual, before I go into the book itself, I am going to talk about its author. So, who was Daniel Defoe? He was born Daniel Foe in 1660 and then changed his name as an adult, but it is not hard to see why. Who would want to be called Mr. Foe, right? But the reason that he changed his name, his family name, by adding D to it was to make it sound more aristocratic. So from Foe we get Defoe. Well, Daniel Defoe's background was as far from aristocratic as you could get. His father was basically a candlestick maker, but a prosperous one, so there was money and plenty of it, but no fancy name. Daniel Defoe's main activity was not writing. He worked as a merchant. He made a lot of money, but he also got himself into a lot of debt. He also got himself into a lot of trouble because of his political activities. He joined in a rebellion known as the Monmouth Rebellion to overthrow the King James II. Thankfully, Daniel Defoe was pardoned. Then he worked as a secret agent for William III. So Daniel Defoe had quite a life. Now, the writing profession is a relatively recent invention. I could be wrong, but I don't think there were any professional writers before the 19th century. So Daniel Defoe was someone whose profession was not writing and who had quite an eventful life, what with joining rebellions and being a secret agent for the King of England. And yet, amidst all of that, he managed to write one of the most important books in world literature, and it wasn't the only great book he wrote. Daniel Defoe was an incredibly prolific writer. Defoe wrote pamphlets and other kinds of political writing and novels such as Robinson Crusoe, A Journal of the Plague Year, Moll Flanders, Roxana, among many others. One fascinating thing about Defoe's childhood and really his education is that he attended a dissidence school. What does that mean? In the 1660s, education in England was mostly in the hands of the Church of England. Children, not all children, just children who attended school, were taught how to read the Bible. And education was mainly in Latin. But Defoe's parents were Presbyterian dissenters, and they sent young Danny maybe, to a dissident school. It was thanks to this that the future writer was educated in the English vernacular. Now, this may not seem that important to us, but when Defoe was a child, the Church of England was not only the only official religion in the land, but also it was illegal to worship outside it. It was illegal to worship outside the Church of England. So anyway, that's what Defoe and his family did. He finally died in 1731 at the age of 70. So now let's go into his novel Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is one of the most successful novels of the 18th century. It was incredibly popular back then when it was first published, and of course it continues to be read to this day. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking about it. Now, when I say that the book was hugely popular in England in the 1700s, that is in relative terms, okay? You need to realize that the population of England was a lot smaller than it is today, and that very few people knew how to read and write. But the rise of the novel in the 18th century and novels like Robinson Crusoe helped increase literacy levels in England. Because before that, there were very few books actually available in English for people to read. Now, Robinson Crusoe must have done wonders because it is written in everyday English. The language used by Defoe in his novel could not have been any simpler. That means that Robinson Crusoe was incredibly accessible, and I would say it is accessible to readers even today, although, of course, you might find some of the language used strange just because the novel was written almost 300 years ago and everyday English has changed a lot, but perhaps not as much as you would think. Robinson Crusoe belongs to that selected group of books that most people have heard about, even if they haven't read it, and that is not always good news because it means that some people may not see the need to read it since they already think they know it. And related to that, some people who haven't read it may have the completely wrong idea about it. But I am here to talk to you about Robinson Crusoe, whether you have read it or not, and tell you why I think you should read it. There will be no spoilers in my review as usual. I never spoil books in my reviews. Now, one of the best things about Robinson Crusoe is how simple the language Defoe uses is. Now, we might take that for granted in contemporary novels, but introducing that kind of everyday language into literature was an important innovation that we owe, at least in part, to Defoe. What was more common then, and some later writers also do this, of course, was to reference all kinds of classical sources in their books. That demanded a lot from readers because in order to make sense of what you read, you would need to know classical, so I'm talking Greek, Latin culture. Now, readers needed tons of knowledge about the classical world. They needed to know about mythology, history, classical literature, etc. to understand and enjoy even contemporary writing. But you don't need all of that cultural baggage to understand Robinson Crusoe. Common readers could then, in the 18th century as now, read and enjoy this novel. Another aspect of Robinson Crusoe that I wanted to discuss is its main character, Robinson Crusoe. We cannot yet talk about having a middle class in the 1700s, but Crusoe, very much like its creator Defoe, belonged to that middle section of society that was beginning to emerge at that time. I don't think we could talk about social mobility yet also, because English society was extremely hierarchical then. I mean, even 300 years later, it still is in many ways. So Crusoe belongs to that middle section of society, and his father encourages him to be contented with his lot in life and not seek any changes in it. Luckily, Crusoe doesn't take heed, and he decides to go on an adventure. Robinson Crusoe is, among other things, a story of overcoming obstacles and attaining a higher socioeconomic status. The novel shows that individuals don't have to occupy a place in society that was predetermined before they were born. In some ways, Robinson Crusoe is the first self-made man in literature. More firsts. Robinson Crusoe was also one of the first novels written in English. The novel is by far the most popular genre now, and I think most people who read literature read novels at least in higher quantities than they do poems or plays, for example. But that wasn't always the case. Of course not. The rise of the novel in English took place in the 1700s, and Robinson Crusoe is one of the most important novels from that initial period. And if you're interested in the history of literature, this is perhaps another good reason for you to pick up this novel if you haven't already. We can consider Daniel Defoe one of the founders of the English novel, or if you prefer, the novel in English. You may or may not know all of this, but what most people do know about Robinson Crusoe is that it is the narrative of a castaway on an island. Of course, that is not what the novel is about, because a novel is never about its plot. But that is what happens in the novel. It's what happens to the main character in the course of the narrative. It is believed that what inspired Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe was the real case of a Scottish castaway whose name was Alexander Selkirk, and who spent 4 years of his life on a desert island in the South Pacific. If you think that 4 years on a desert island is a lot, in the novel, Robinson Crusoe spends 28 years on an island near the coast of Trinidad and Venezuela in the Caribbean Sea. But the narrative doesn't begin with Robinson on the island, but a lot sooner than that. Another misconception some people have about this novel is thinking that Robinson Crusoe is an adventure book for children. And if you think that, you may not be entirely wrong. There are many versions for children that were popular, particularly from the 19th century on. And of course, all of those spin-offs, TV and movie adaptations that everyone has heard about. Now, those later versions and adaptations for children tend to focus on the adventure aspects of the novel. But I would encourage you to read the original version, which is most definitely not for children. Defoe's novel deals with religion, guilt, and yes, Robinson Crusoe can also be read as an adventure novel because of all the adventures that the main character goes through. Not just being a castaway, but also being enslaved in Africa, and then once a free man again, becoming involved in the slave trade. And all of this happens before he's cast away on the island where he will spend 28 years of his life. Now, that part of the narrative that takes place on the island is rich in descriptive detail on how Crusoe manages to survive there. Anything from how he makes bread to how he shelters himself when it rains. But Crusoe is not alone through all this. Apart from his ingenuity, there's also providence. He may be alone on the island, but he has God's help. Now, this is something that probably sounds strange to many readers today. Not to everyone, obviously, because there are still people who believe in God and providence. But anyway, Robinson is full of guilt and feels like his castaway situation is a punishment from God for having left his father's home in defiance to his father's orders early in the novel. Now, one of the rather few things Robinson is able to salvage from this shipwreck is ink and paper. And that allows him to keep a diary in which he talks to himself and to God. And that is fascinating because it allows us, readers in the early 21st century, to enter the mind of a God-fearing Protestant man from the early 18th century. And does God let him down? Does God let Crusoe down? Of course not. Things begin to go better for him on the island thanks to providence, divine providence. And then he meets another man, a man who will become his companion, but never his equal. This other man is not European. He's indigenous, and between the two men, there will be a colonial relationship. Crusoe is the colonizer, and the other man, whom he calls Friday, becomes the colonized. And again, this is fascinating because it allows us, 21st century readers, to enter the mind of the colonizer. In this instance, the mind of the Protestant British colonizer. The British colonizer, Crusoe, acts almost like God. He gives the colonized a name, like Adam named all creatures in the book of Genesis. He gives him a language, in this case English, and of course a religion, in this case Christianity. That is exactly what colonizers did in real life, no matter that the colonized already had names, languages, and religions of their own, so they didn't need new ones. Now, okay, many people are now critical, to say the least, about the European colonization process during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries by the then maritime superpowers, Spain and Portugal, followed by Britain and France, among others. So it can be shocking for us to see how colonization was seen as something positive at the time of Robinson Crusoe, but I think it is important that we understand that mentality that dominated back then and the central role religion played in all of this. And if you're interested in any of this, you just cannot afford to miss out on reading Robinson Crusoe. Of course, you know, colonization and empire building were carried out differently depending on who was doing it. For example, Spanish colonies were not organized like British ones. So you must bear that in mind. You must bear in mind that the colonization model Crusoe imposes on the island is the British Protestant one. Now, whether you are European or from a country that was once a European colony, particularly I would say a British colony, I think Robinson Crusoe is a must read.